Hey guys, Stealth here. This time bringing you another notable series or notable units series, and this time we're covering the French. Now, let's delve right into it. The French, as far as I'm concerned, do not have any interesting units in logistics. You just got your command infantry, you got your command jeep, APC, tank, supply units, etc. Not really interesting. They do have a command helicopter, nothing interesting here, it's just a regular helicopter, so no really interesting units in here. Infantry, they do have some interesting units. As one of the few nations in the game, they get the ATGM LAN F3, maybe they are the only one, I'm not too sure at this point. But if you look at the ATGM LAN F1 and F2, these are pretty common. The British use them, the Germans use them to some extent. There are good ATGMs. The F3 is better. Let's compare the F3 to the F2 so you know what I'm talking about. If you look at the F2, this thing has the same range, but it has less accuracy and less AP power. Now this does mean that with this 2-point power or 2-point difference in power and more accuracy, you can hit more targets and do more damage to them. And that's only for 5 points. If you compare availability, you got 7 or 5 for the Milan F3 versus 10 and 7 for the Milan F2. So making your choice for the Milan F2 or the F3 will vary with the map you're facing and the situation. If you're doing, for example, a 10v10, you might be using the F3 just because you don't have that many units to micromanage. If you're doing a 1v1 and you have a large front, you might want to bring the Milan F2 just to make sure you can cover every part of the region with those ATGMs. Now the Milan F3 do have a bit less availability as I mentioned, but in the end the accuracy and the amount of missiles hitting the target are about the same. Keep in mind though that they do have a large variety of transports, so you can bring them in whatever you like, including the Panther. And this does kinda add up to the price point, because if you bring these guys in just their standard VAP, they cost you 35. If you bring them in the Panther, the transport's even more precious, more pricey than the Milan itself. So it's gonna net you a 55-point cost. So it can get pretty costly the moment you move up. Generally, I would recommend a cheap transport or cheaper transport, like the VAP or the AMX-10P, just to have an autocannon to support the infantry in case it comes up against infantry, which is not something that these guys are especially well trained for. Now, you could say that, to counter, we always need to discuss how to counter these guys. Countering Milan F3s is pretty easy, just drop a few mortar rounds on top of them. Mortar rounds, artillery rounds, anything that exceeds its 2450 meter range. So napalm tanks are not a good option here because they only have a 1000 meter range. Mortars are good, artillery is good, anything with decent to high HE power will work. Helicopters are recommended, both helicopter pods, so the rocket pods and their autocannons. And you can also use just a general napalm bomber. So these guys are pretty easy to dispose of. Moving on to Commando Marines. You could say that there is nothing special about these guys, but I don't think so, because there are not that many 15 strength squads in the game. And the few there are, not always are at the elite training level. Now, what can you do with these guys? It really depends on your preference. You can use these guys to quickly capture an area before your main force arrives. So in my deck I would have a Commando Marine in a Panther, or a Puma Pirate, or a Puma. These guys travel at 250 or 300. You quickly take the town, and once you have the town, your range force of, say, Chasseurs or Legion can then take over. These guys have 12 LRAC rockets, and this means that they can take out a lot of vehicles using their 70% accuracy. And 16 AP power, although it will not slice through the heaviest of tanks, will still do a lot of damage to most medium point tanks. They also have the AA-52 SAW or Squad Automatic Weapon, and this means that with the CQC tech you can use them for block-to-block fighting or in-block fighting, and this is what they are very good at. You could also go with these guys behind enemy lines. They have good stealth but only medium optics, so they are going to be escorted by Commandos Para from the Recon tab. And if you combine those two you have a good hunter-killer group. To counter these guys, don't use infantry, because they are generally very resilient, especially since they're a 15-man squad. But if you use artillery, if you use a napalm bomber or something with a lot of HE power, they will die pretty quickly. Also, using tanks is an option, although a tank gun will take at least 5 rounds before they wipe out the Commando Marines. Because they are a 15-man squad, and once these guys are actually entrenched in a building, they are sometimes pretty tough to root out using a tank. And when you're using a tank, make sure to stay away from that 525 meter rocket on the LREC F1. Finally, in the infantry tab, we got the Legion. Moreover, we got the Legion 90. These guys are interesting, and I mean the Legion 90, not so much the Legion. Legion are good units, you can use these guys as line infantry, but the Legion 90 are more interesting because they carry the Eric's ATGM. And this means that they are classed as light infantry, although the game calls them a rifle team. I would call them light infantry because they have a longer range standoff ATGM instead of the rocket/RPG that, for example, the Commando Marines have. The best application for Legion I've found is to either come in with Commando Marines and take a town pretty quickly, waiting for the main force to arrive, or to be the main force itself. You can bring these guys in VABs, VAB 20/13, so with an autocannon, Puma or Puma Pirates, again with an autocannon. And if you do this, you got a pretty mobile force, but the price will go up. If you put them in the Pirate, you gotta be paying 50 for one squad of infantry, which I think is way too much, unless you're using these things very strategically to capture ground early on. But then please coordinate with the Commando Marines and make sure you bring the right unit at the right time. A note to make about this Eric launcher: it's very accurate and it has a very high AP power for an ATGM that is just carried by infantry like this. This ATGM is almost as good as the Milan F3, and they carry more of those. The difference is range. This thing has 2450 meter range, this one only 1000. The Legion 90 also are quite capable of fighting against other infantry squads with their mini-me SAW. And you can use this in CQC, so you can use this in the same block fighting, house-to-house fighting. To counter Legion, pretty much the same deal as the Milans and the Marines. Just make sure that you don't use tanks against these guys, or that your tanks or autocannons are firing at a ground range greater than 1050 meters. Helicopters are excellent against these guys. Again, rocket pods are the way to go. Stuff like napalm will kill them, bombs will kill them. I mean, they're just infantry. They are not armored. They are not meant to take a lot of punishment. Deploy them in forests, deploy them in towns, and these guys will serve you very well. In the support tab, I couldn't really find any interesting units. We got the Caesar. This is of course a very interesting unit because it has a long range, a high rate of fire for a howitzer. This is really the high end, 6 rounds a minute, and low dispersion. Caesars are mostly snipers. These things can hit pretty much anything at good range, and they don't have to stay near a fob. They do carry only 18 rounds, so with 3 salvos they're empty. But if you want to, you can have them a bit closer to your front lines, and that way have less travel time on the shell. Use the Caesar to pound stuff which is not that heavily armored, because it doesn't have an AP power as most mortars. As most howitzers, it only has an HE power. And this means that you can effectively snipe command vehicles, AA units, and infantry that's out in the open. You can go after vehicles and even tanks if you want to, but don't expect to do a lot of damage against those. dealing with tanks is something that other units do way better, and you might not want to spend your time firing your Caesar at it. An AA unit that I find notable in this section is the VLRA Mistral. It's just a very simple solution. You take a flatbed truck and you put a Mistral launcher on it. By the way, this is exactly the same Mistral that the infantry carries, but this platform is a lot more mobile. It goes 90 kph off-road, has 0 armor, but then again it only costs you 35 points. So the VLRA Mistral with 10 or 7 availability and 60% accuracy means that you have a very cheap anti-helicopter defense, and this will really serve you because most helicopters are more expensive than those 35 points, unless you're using some of the spam choppers that China or Russia have. But let's say that you're not. Let's say you're using a standard gunship ranging from 50 to about 150 points. Fire 2 Mistral missiles at it for only 35 points, and you got your kill. And you got a unit that earned itself anywhere between 2 to 5 times its own worth. So that's why I really find these things notable. French units seem to be very accurate. They are also called the always hit guns. And this is quite accurate, literally, because these things have 60% accuracy. And on most units from the French you will find that accuracy seems to be a priority. Firepower, not so much, and armor definitely not, because this thing is unarmored. And that also leads me to conclude that this thing is very easy to deal with so long as you're using anything but a helicopter or an airplane. A mortar will kill this thing, a howitzer will kill this thing faster, infantry, IFVs, APCs, tanks, whatever you want to use, just don't use anything that is flying, because the VLRA will take it down. Now, you could say that the Crotal is a notable unit because it has a good range against helicopters, a decent range against against airplanes. But I found that these things have failed me more often than not. I don't find them that useful. These rockets, if they hit, do 5 HE power, which is the same as the Mistral. They have the same amount of suppression, the same reload, and they only carry 4, where the Mistral carries 8. You could say that the additional range against helicopters would help. Yes, it does. But the 45% accuracy does not, because that means that you're going to have to resupply these things very often. Most times these things will miss, especially if they are only at the trained veterancy. If you push them up to a hardened veterancy, they're going to be a little more accurate, but I've played quite a few games with these things in my deck, and after a couple of trials I just could not find a good use for them. So, in my opinion, not a notable unit. Moving on to the tanks. French tanks in general are fast, especially off-road. All of these have an off-road speed of 60 or better. If you compare that to the British, which only travel at 35 to 55 at best, you're going to see that the French excel at hit and run tactics. And if you're looking at these armor values in the bottom right side, you're also going to see that armor is not exactly their strong suit. The British tanks, by comparison, are very heavily armored. If you take a Challenger Mark 1, I think it has 19 frontal armor. This thing is the best that the AMX-30 tank line has to offer, and it only has 11 frontal armor. By the way, you're looking at the Harpoon for the AMX-13, I was talking about this tank. The AMX-40 has 12 armor, but again, not very interesting armor-wise. They are, however, interesting in other aspects, that for 80 points you get a 65% accuracy, and you get an autocannon, and that is what makes this for me a notable unit, because it does quite a few things very well. It even has a stabilizer, and that is not something that most French units have. You can see that this entire 30B line does not, or 30 line, it starts from the AMX-30, does not have a stabilizer. So these things excel at getting to their destination quickly, and either setting up an ambush or firing a couple of shots while they're sitting still and then getting the hell out again. To counter the French tanks, use something that has a higher AP power. If you're doing anything higher than 12, let's say that you're not dealing with the clerks yet, anything higher than 12 will do. These things are not stabilized, as I said. So the moment that you're not, or that you're pushing these things on the move, that you're attacking them while they're on the move, they will not be able to fire at you. Some of these will be able to fire with an autocannon, but the AMX-30 doesn't even have that, so this thing is completely defenseless as long as it's on the move. So if you want to keep someone occupied, if you want to destroy some of these units, use ATGMs or use mortars to stun the enemy. Make sure that the tank is weakened a little bit and then go after it with your own tanks. Of course, helicopters with ATGMs are also a very nice solution, and this way you can quickly dispose of these soft-skinned French tanks. Talking about soft skin, you got the AMX-13 Harpoon, which has even less armor. I see absolutely no reason to put this thing in your deck, so not a notable unit. The AMX 10 RC5B you could say is interesting because it has a very high off-road speed and you can use these things in pretty high numbers, but that is not something special enough for me to make it a notable unit. The Leclerc, however, is a notable unit because it has this GAT 120mm gun. It fires at 2275, nothing special there, but the accuracy, especially on the move, is exceptional. This is something that most units can only dream of, and this will mean that this tank is very, very nice to be using on the move. So with this tank you push, you quickly go after some units and then you get yourself into cover, but because it's still a 160 point vehicle. And these are pretty sought after vehicles to kill, because they quickly get you a lot of points and they are extremely deadly. Now not only the accuracy and the stabilizer make this thing interesting, but also the all-round package. It has medium optics, it has a good amount of frontal armor, 20. Surely it's not the highest in the game like the Challenger Mark II, which has 23. But if you're looking at the 20 frontal armor, the 21 AP power, the extremely high rate of fire for a tank, 12 rounds a minute because it has an autoloader, means that this is a very nice all-round tank. It can do almost anything well. The weak side of this thing is a low amount of ammunition. If you have plenty of targets for this tank, it'll run out of ammunition in less than 2 minutes if it keeps up this rate of fire. And 9 times out of 10 it will, because this is an autoloader. And that means that it will continue to fire even if its crew is stunned. If they're stunned they're not going to fire. But even if the crew is panicked, it will still maintain this rate of fire. So how do you deal with these things? Well, they do not have the highest amount of frontal armor in the game. So some of the top end ATGMs can slice through the front of this thing quite easily actually. 20 frontal armor is good and it will defend against a lot of tanks, but it will not defend against, for example, a Vampire missile from the VDV. Or it will not defend against some of the high-end ATGMs fired by the top Russian helicopters. So tank snipers like ATGM planes will effectively deal with this thing very quickly. Same for helicopters. If you want to use vehicles or tanks, try to come in from the side of this thing, because this side is only 7 points thick, and that means that you really do a lot of damage once you're firing at the sides. Of course the rear is even worse, and if you have a player against you who's using this tank who is not as experienced yet, he may not use reverse move. So if that happens and he exposes the rear of this tank while it's retreating, you shoot 2 or 3 times at it and it is gone. Moving on, Recon. Again, quite a few units here, but it's mostly the same unit in different transports, so don't let the high amount of Hussards or Hussards 85 fool you. The AMX 1390, for me this is a notable unit because it also carries this autoloader. And for 30 points you get something that can effectively deal with quite a bit of vehicles early on in the game. Let's say that you use this unit in the initial push, it's going to be escorting your main infantry. The infantry are in the VAB or another transport. This one keeps up with it, and with 8 AP power and 13 rounds a minute it can quickly decimate any opposing force, so long as those things aren't too heavily armored. And that is a very nice capability to have for only 30 points. The downside, and the easy way to take this thing out, is to use anything, because it is virtually unarmored. 2 frontal, 1 side, 1 back, 1 top. Helicopters, planes, heavier tanks, IFVs with autocannons, infantry with RPGs, anything can take this tank down. So that, in that respect, is not very exceptional. But the high speed, good optics, and low price means that this thing for me is quite an interesting unit to use. Other than the 1390, we got the VBL Mistral. Now, this sporty looking Jeep is something that you should not underestimate. It might not be heavily armored, but it is extremely quick, 95 kph, has very good optics, and carries 6 of those Mistral missiles. That means that this thing can both be your eyes and your AA to some extent, because they only carry 6 of those. But if you use this one in combination with one of the VLRA Mistrals from the support tab I talked about earlier, you're going to have quite a decent defense against helicopters. Fighting airplanes is not their strong suit because they don't have that much range against them, only 2100. But 60% accuracy and 60% stabilizer, so this thing can do 95 and still hit you, means that this thing is a very, very nice unit to have. HE power is 5 like most Mistrals, suppression is the same and reload is the same. Road speed is 150 because it's a wheeled vehicle, that means it'll go very, very quickly on the road. But I would recommend using this thing off-road and jumping from cover to cover, bush to bush, to make sure that you don't get exposed. If you do, it's going to die pretty quickly. And talking about dying, if you want this unit dead, just go after it with some infantry, but make sure that the infantry is well concealed, because this thing does have a machine gun on top of it. And tanks are exceptionally good against this thing. 1 armor means that a tank shell, maybe 2 tank shells, will destroy this unit, and that scores you a 55-point kill. Don't come at it with helicopters because they will get taken out. Same for planes, I would be a bit careful with those. But a howitzer or mortar will also quickly turn this nice Jeep into a bit of scrap metal. Now, other units, I don't find that interesting. It's just your Recon infantry, it's a Gazelle, a Recon helicopter armed with an autocannon. I don't find any of these that special. So we're moving on to the vehicle tab, and this is where something gets a bit more interesting, because this is where we find the AMX 10P/Milan. This one carries the Milan F1, and it is a bit of a mix between an IFV and an ATGM carrier. They call it a tank destroyer. In my opinion, it is more like an IFV without the infantry. So this is a fire support vehicle, more accurately, because it can engage both infantry using that M693 F1 autocannon and take out tanks with the Milan F1. Keep in mind though that the Milan F1 is not accurate. You will not be able to score an instant hit most of the time, unless these things have made it all the way up to elite. So if you want to be sure that you kill a lot of vehicles, deploy these guys in groups of 2 or 3. That way you have a bit more autocannon fire, they can take down a bit more infantry, and they can take down quite some vehicles or even tanks with that Milan F1. Now this thing is a notable unit for me because most tank destroyers, most ATGM carriers don't have an autocannon. And the fact that this thing has an autocannon means that it's quite capable of defending itself against infantry that might sneak up on it. Still, it's not very heavily armored. And if you want one of these things dead, you fire some mortars at it, you fire artillery, you try to drop some bombs on it using any type of bomber, because low armor means that the HE damage will really shock this unit. And do not engage it with tanks, because tanks are gonna be devastated by this Milan F1. An effective way to deal with ATGM carriers all around is to deploy smoke around them first. That way, if you still want to engage with tanks, if tanks are the only thing you have, you fire a smoke screen around it. You move up with your tanks, and at very short range the tank will easily win from the Milan AMX 10P. The other unit which is slightly interesting, slightly notable, is the ERC 90. Sorry French guys, I'm not even going to pronounce this. I don't know how to. If you do, please let me know in the comments. I do look to improve my pronunciation on that area. Anyway, This is a very fast vehicle, 95 kph. So again, use this thing in ambushes, in flanking maneuvers, and to get across rivers because it's amphibious. 48 kph means that you can cross smaller rivers pretty fast, but don't use this thing to go crawling all the way across the sea because that is not what this is designed for. Use these things as ambushes or skirmishers to quickly wipe out some vehicles. If you don't like the AMX 1390, which we have here, you could go with one of these guys or two of these guys as an escort for your main infantry force, because they can quickly take out some of the vehicles carrying their infantry, so that's the infantry from the enemy, and some tanks, because 11 AP power is nice. But the weak end of this thing is completely armorless. One armor in my book ranks pretty much the same as armorless, so a tank shell will quickly take it out, and since this thing only has 1925 meter range, you can take it out quite quickly using a tank, and quite safely, because most tanks, especially since most tanks have a range of 2275, they can take out this ERC-90 very quickly. Of course, it does carry a machine gun, so infantry might not be your best bet. But if these things are storming your town and you do have some RPG infantry inside of it, these things are making a mistake because that is not what they were designed to do. These guys are designed to snipe from afar, try and flank the enemy so your infantry can take them out. Moving on to helos, and this is where, oh, I forgot one actually. We got the Tiger HAP and the Tiger HAD, or HAP and HAD. The difference between these helicopters becomes obvious once you compare them. They both carry this autocannon, and they have exactly the same specs on that, so that is not very interesting. The HAD variant is dedicated to fighting ground vehicles. You can see that it carries the HOT 2, and that is a very nice ATGM. 25 AP power, 55% accuracy and 45% stabilizer. So this thing can fly at full speed, 280, and still hit you with an HOT 2 missile. It does not carry that many rocket pods. 24 rockets is a bit on the low end for a helicopter using rocket pods. But if you want to put some rocket pods onto someone, if you want to put some rockets onto someone, you use the HAP, which is more geared towards anti-air combat. And you can see that this one also carries a Mistral. It's like the French put Mistrals on everything nowadays. And the Mistral is quite capable of taking out helicopters at good range. If you do a duel with a HAP versus, for example, an Mi-24V, you stand a good chance of actually winning that fight. Because this thing rarely misses, 60% accuracy and 60% stabilizer, so again, very accurate fire even on the move. And that means that these things are quite capable at both taking out ground vehicles and air units. Just make sure you combine the two. If you combine these, you have a good solid helicopter force. If you use one of them, let's say I'm only using the HAP, you got a weak spot. Because this thing cannot engage anti-air vehicles like SPAGs or long-range anti-air guns at a good range. It only has those 2100 meter rocket pods and the 1575 meter autocannon, and that is not enough if you're dealing with an AA gun. So taking out these things, use AA guns, use manpads, but make sure that the manpads have a range of 2100 or greater, and that they are concealed, preferably in a building, otherwise they will wipe them out. If you're dealing with the HAD, pretty much the same deal, except that you might not be able to use anti-air guns or anti-air missiles mounted on vehicles as much, because they carry those HOT 2s, and considering that these things have medium optics, they can spot for themselves, and they can kill your, let's say it's a Tunguska at long range. Of course the Tunguska still has a bit more range than the Tiger, but still try not to engage these Tiger HAD versions if you're using an AA gun. And if you are using an AA gun, 2625 or greater. Finally, in the helicopter tab, the Cassiope, or the Cassiope, I'm not sure where the pronunciation should be. It's a 35-point helicopter which only carries the GAT-30 autocannon, and that's the same one that is mounted on the Tiger helicopters. Cassiope is a very good helicopter to support your units against vehicles and infantry. It does not do very well against tanks because it only has 3 AP power, but most vehicles and infantry carriers are very easily dealt with using this autocannon at a range of 1575. Now that is also immediately the weak spot of this unit, because if you're dealing with an infantry carrier that has an autocannon on top of it, the autocannon will usually have the same range, 1575. And then it becomes a slugging match. Who can quickly take down the other party? And I generally don't like those kinds of fights where I might lose this helicopter, because it means I have to bring in another one, lose a couple of points, etc. So in this case I would bring in the Cassiope in a situation where it can reinforce my infantry to fight against vehicles, and I would be really picky with my engagements if I bring in a group of 2 or 3 of these guys, because sometimes they will get wiped out quite easily. Talking about wiping them out, an AA gun will do. Any AA gun is safe when used against this helicopter, because most AA guns have a range of at least 1500, and I'm not talking about those outdated SPOGs that some of the Russian or Chinese forces still use, but I'm talking about something that has a range of 1800 to 2800. So taking out the Cassiope should not be too difficult. It's not that heavily armored, it only has 6 strength, and that means that a couple of AA weapons will easily take it down. Now, you could say that the Celtic is an interesting helicopter, maybe, but for me it's just a flying Mistral platform. And since I 9 times out of 10 use the Mistral on the Recon, on the VBL Mistral, and on the VLRA Mistral, and maybe even on the Tiger HAP, I will not even need this Celtic. So I'm not going to label it a notable unit. In the Air tab I could only find 2 units which are actually interesting. First off, the Rafale F1. The Rafale is the air superiority fighter, 180 points, very expensive unit, but you do get quite some nice specs for it. Turn radius of 300, 10 point strength, 50 point ECM, so that is very good at dodging missiles, exceptional air detection and high speed. It carries 2 types of missiles, which you are not going to find anywhere outside the French army. They are all fire and forgets. They have 6 short-range air-to-air missiles for fighting airplanes at short range, so say dogfighting. But keep in mind that these things can also be used very, very nicely when dealing with a helicopter swarm. Since they are fire and forgets, as most short-range missiles, you don't have to look at them. And that means that you can take out a lot of helicopters by just flying through them or flying over them, and have this Rafale drop a couple of these missiles, hopefully taking down some of those helicopters. But usually that's not what you bring in this thing for. If you bring in the Rafale, you're dealing with large-scale air operations from the enemy team, and that is when you're going to use this air-to-air missile. 7,000 meter range, high accuracy, decent HE power, and they carry 4 of those. Fire and forget, so you don't have to stick around waiting to see if your missiles actually impact. You just launch a couple of those missiles at long range to deal with the enemy threat, and you get out, because you don't want a 180 point plane circling overhead too long. You only get one of them, and that is also their weak spot. If you can manage to kill these things, and it is not that difficult, it's not as difficult as you might imagine, you just have to manage to use the right weapon. Don't hunt these things down with other air superiority fighters, because they will either be evac'd or they will actually take down your air superiority fighters. The best way to take down the Rafale is to use man-pads early on. So infantry carrying AA, using anti-air guns to stun the unit and then take it down using an air superiority fighter or a long-range AA weapon like the Cub M4, the Tor should do, and there are some other units which can really take down this unit at a safe range. They are not that easy to deal with because they have 50% ECM. You might need a couple of different unit combined to take it down. But if you take it down, it's the only unit that this card gets. So once this thing is down, you know that you have probably about 20% of the enemy air force destroyed. And you score yourself a nice 180 points. The other unit from the plane section I wanted to highlight is the Super Etendar SEM. And this thing is notable because it has a very, very high accuracy on the ATGM. It only carries one of those. You can see it right here. I'm interested to see exactly how this thing maintains balance, because you'd say that if you're carrying a 30 AP power ATGM, the plane would be listing to this side. It would be so heavy on this side of the wing that it would completely go to the right side all the time. But anyway, that's a detail. We're talking about this unit because it has pretty good stats all around. 30% ECM, very good air detection, but you don't use this thing as an air superiority fighter. But the good air detection does mean that you know when to get these things out. And you can get them out at a good range too, because they have a 3.5 kilometer range on that SALH missile. The AS30L will take down pretty much any ground unit that you fire it at. Just make sure you don't waste missiles like this, firing at 10 or 20 point APCs and IFVs. The reason you bring these in is if you're dealing with the super heavy tanks. If you got a couple of T90s facing off against you, you bring in the Super Etendar SEM and the T90 suddenly disappears because the 30 AP power missile hits. And hit it will with 70% accuracy. Now, to deal with these things, pretty much the same way you deal with all planes, use layered air defense. So use a couple of AA guns combined with manpads if you can stash them somewhere in towns or forests, and backed up by some long-range AA. You can also hunt these things down using air superiority fighters, but you're going to have to be quick. The best way to do it is to have Recon near the enemy spawn to make sure that you can see immediately when these things are being brought in, because they won't be around that long. That 3,500 meter range on their ATGM will mean that they can quickly drop it and get out, and since it's the only weapon that they carry that they need to deliver to the battlefield, these things will not hang around. 750 kph does mean that they can be quite easily intercepted using faster air superiority fighters, so you can use those. But just make sure that the Super Etendar does not lure you into a trap where you think that this thing is just circling over friendly lines or over the lines of the enemy in your situation, and that you send air superiority fighters out to get it, because you just might run into the air defense network of the Blue 4, which is exactly what they had in mind. So that's it for me for the notable units for the French. I hope you liked this video. If there are any French units which you think are notable, please let me know in the comments. What is notable about that unit and why? Why do you like it so much? I look forward to hearing from you, and if you liked this video, please hit that like button. I'll be doing a lot more of these. I'm just going down the list by nations, so if you start the new deck creation, you can see what nation is coming up, and all of these videos are in a playlist, and the link to the playlist is in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.